After the glories of the Spanish Armada, England made the mistake of trying to take one step too far and proactively attacked the Spanish Navy. But this time the Spanish Navy got the better of the English fleet, bringing things back to an uncertain status quo. But it was an evenly balanced status quo. The brilliance of John Hawkins' tactics against the Armada, of using ships' cannons, keeping at a distance to sink the enemy ships rather than going in close and requiring soldiers to board, proved that England as an island nation needn't have a standing army on land to repel invasions if the navy was strong enough to repel attackers at sea before they got a chance to land. The problem for the Queen was that Ireland was Roman Catholic, and it would serve Spain as an excellent base from which to mount an attack on England. But beyond the Pale, the protective fence round Dublin, Ireland was a violent and dangerous place. This comment was published shortly before the Spanish Armada. There is no land in the world of so continual war within itself, nay, of so great shedding of Christian blood, nay, of so great robbing, spoiling, praying, and burning, nay, of so great wrongful extortion continually, as Ireland. Ireland was known throughout Europe as a land with no law and order. It was comparable to England in the 6th and 7th centuries, little kings fighting each other for fun. And to bring a degree of peace, law and order to Ireland was high on Elizabeth's agenda throughout her reign, but especially in the last decade of it. She did it by building bridges, roads and fortifications, and granting land to people from Scotland in the hope that they would provide a better example of how to live peaceably. It was a temporary solution. It dealt with the Spanish menace, but it created as many problems as it solved. The indigenous Irish resented the confiscation of their lands, and it consolidated the island of Ireland as a population of overwhelmingly Roman Catholics, simply because they didn't like the English and wanted to be different, with a minority Protestant population who held the power, thus laying the groundwork for centuries of internal strife. The way in which the Queen, her council, Parliament and the people had united to deal with the Spanish threat had bred a kind of confidence that had never been seen in England before. In addition to the grand houses built for the nobles, some of which are still standing today, at the end of her reign, people were beginning to look after each other with the poor law, and wealthier members of the community were increasingly making provision for the building and resourcing of almshouses to look after a certain number of the poor of their own community. 4 times as many of the youth of the nation were now being educated at schools and universities than had been the case 50 years earlier, and even girls were getting an education which had never been heard of before. The purposes of this basic education were nicely explained by one countryman. This is what he said: "This is all we go to school for, to read common prayers at church and set down common prices at market, to write a letter and make a bond, set down the day of our birth, our marriage day, and to write our will when we are sick." The gap in the social services of the time created by the dissolution of the monasteries, in education, in healthcare, and the provision of temporary accommodation, was filled by demands from within the community, and because of the prosperity of the nation, private local initiatives could succeed in those areas. The increase in skepticism about all sorts of so-called authorities offering solutions to various problems in everyday life, religious, astrological, mystical and magical, a skepticism that had sparked the Reformation, sparked a different kind of search for the truth, a demand for a kind of certainty, which created an interest in searching for new knowledge, in finding a means to test it, and in sharing it when it had been satisfactorily verified. A search which the freedoms of England encouraged, in contrast to the prohibitive disciplines of the Roman Church on mainland Europe. Right up to the end of her reign, Elizabeth was laying the foundations for the future prosperity of this country, the effects of which would last directly for 200 or 300 years. But the situation ruthlessly consolidated by Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell in the reign of Henry VIII, of the sovereign holding an absolute authority, was still the case. And when the sovereign had the interests of the British people at heart, that was fine. But when Elizabeth died in 1603, she was succeeded by the Protestant son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England and the first of the Stuart monarchs. He had many of the more regrettable and less endearing characteristics of his mother: arrogant, effeminate, highly intellectual, and contemptuous of almost everyone, a combination which, with his ideology of the divine right of kings, would lead to the last fundamental challenge facing Great Britain, which we'll look at a little later. The key to the success of Elizabeth's lasting legacy is undoubtedly her moderation and tolerance in all things. Britain had long since learnt how to profit from its wealth of raw materials. Trade was the lifeblood of the prosperity of England, and the opportunities presented by the opening up of the sea routes to the Spice Islands were seized upon by a group of merchants in London in 1600, who applied to the Queen and got a charter to trade. They called themselves the East India Company, and they would equip ships to sail round the Cape of Good Hope to the East Indies, and when their ship came back, the proceeds would be shared according to the number of shares which had been bought, to enable the enterprise to take place. Hence the expression, when your ship comes in. For the explorers, in addition to the East Indies, if you sailed west, you would reach the West Indies, and with the northern shores of the North American continent still largely unexplored, the number of explorers laid claim to these new lands for the European nations that had sponsored them. Newfound Land was the imaginative name given by Sir Humphrey Gilbert to the island that he found and claimed for his queen. A favourite courtier of Elizabeth I, Walter Raleigh, set out to explore and colonise the east coast of North America, which had not yet been occupied by the French or the Spanish. The name he gave to his eventually successful colonisation in honour of his queen was a little more imaginative: Virginia. But the settlement itself, made in 1607, was given the name in honour of the new king, Jamestown. Conspicuous amongst the names of these early settlements are either the name of the king or the name of the place the settlers had originally come from, including later settlements made in the reigns of King Charles and King George of England and King Louis of France. A number of cruel lessons were learnt by these early settlers, many of whom perished because of lack of adequate preparation, not least landing in the autumn after the planting season and having to get through a winter with inadequate supplies. On more than one occasion, a relieving supplies ship from England would arrive to find no trace of the settlers they had left the previous year. The initial friendship of the local populations, the native Indians, was lost when the clash of cultures became obvious. The settlers were putting up barriers and claiming land. "How can you own land?" said the Indians. "The land belongs to all of us." But the gun was to prove more powerful than the bow and arrow. However, thanks to the enterprise of Walter Raleigh, we have the American land and the American Indians to thank for the potato and the tobacco that he brought back with him. And as we look at the Queen dancing with one of her courtiers, the final element of Elizabeth I's legacy is the arts, notably poetry. The name Gloriana comes from a groundbreaking work by Edmund Spenser published in 1590 called The Fairy Queen. We've been listening to the music of William Byrd, Thomas Tallis and Orlando Gibbons. The birth of the scientific method with Francis Bacon, the writings of John Donne, and of course the theatre. The whole artistic culture, so strong in Britain today, was born in the Elizabethan era. And undoubtedly the person who made the greatest impression of those dramatists was William Shakespeare. In 1595 he published a play called Richard II, and in it there is an analysis of the British way of life which has been cherished ever since. It's spoken by John of Gaunt, the son of Edward III, and the man from whom is descended the line of kings, including Henry VII, all the way through to the Tudors. It begins, "Methinks I am a prophet, new inspired." And it goes on, "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds, as far from home for Christian service and true chivalry as is the sepulchre in stubborn Jewry of the world's ransom, Blessed Mary's Son. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself.